Hey guys, our last lecture of the class is going to be on social and economic factors of conservation. And the first thing I want to talk to you about today is the role of zoos and gardens. There was a time when entertaining people was really the only important goal for a zoo, aquarium, and botanical garden. And it was all about things like watching sea lions balance a ball or chimpanzees having a tea party. And today, those types of shows are actually really uncommon in zoos and gardens. And they've placed far more emphasis on public education. Organisms are often displayed in settings that simulate their natural environment and occasionally in multi-species groups. And most exhibits are also accompanied by signs that both identify the species and describe their natural history. And in species at risk of extinction, it's usually emphasized that they're at risk on these signs and in these displays. And there's likely to be detailed information about its plight and what can be done to save it and what is being done. And more of a central theme to these institutions is conservation. And they're using a lot of different channels to communicate this message beyond just signs next to exhibits. They're actually creating publications, having lecture series, visiting schools, interacting with local and with mass media. And if these institutions did nothing else than just that, beyond giving people like a tangible link between themselves and a group of organisms and nature and the fate of our ecosystems, their role would still be very praiseworthy, even if this is all they're doing. But they're actually doing a lot more than that too. So modern zoos and aquariums and botanical gardens employ a lot of biologists. And pretty much if you give biologists the daily access to little known species from all over the globe, they're going to learn a lot of new things. So conducting scientific research has become an important role for these institutions. For many species, our understanding of their physiology and their diseases and their reproductive biology and nutrition and so on has come primarily from studies in captive populations. So naturally, there's limits to what we can learn about a species outside of its natural habitat, especially about things like ecological interactions. But nevertheless, any information is better than none. And some of the things that we've learned with captive populations have been vital. The idea that inbreeding could be a problem for wild animals living in small isolated reserves was actually largely generated by detailed analysis of zoo breeding records that revealed many of the mammal species manifested inbreeding depression. So major institutions will even go a step further, and they'll become directly involved with ex situ conservation. And what that means is that they're maintaining organisms outside of their natural habitat. So zoos and aquariums and botanical gardens generally do this through careful husbandry of captive populations, including, among other things, management of breeding systems to minimize loss of genetic diversity and avoid domestication. Some institutions maintain biodiversity by storing seeds, spores, sperm, embryos, similar material, as well as microorganisms. And it's important that ex situ and in situ, which is conservation in native environments, it's important that they work together and they're carefully integrated with one another. Because ex situ populations are really there for three main reasons. Number one is they are insurance against the loss of native populations. They're also a direct contributor to conservation of wild populations through education and research and funding if necessary. And they're also a source for reintroduction projects. So these are three really important factors that come into ex situ conservation. A long history of breeding domesticated plants and animals has provided ex situ conservationists with kind of a starting point from which they can develop their efforts to maintain captive populations of wild species. And usually they try to avoid things like artificial selection of with the assumption that someday a portion of their stock is going to be returned to the wild and subjected to natural selection again. Also of great interest to ex situ conservationists are practices designed to maximize the retention of genetic diversity. So such practices can be relatively simple, so things like preventing siblings from mating with one another, or they can be really elaborate depending on the type of genetic variation that you want to manage. So most practices require that you keep track of each individual's ancestors, so their pedigree or their lineage. And however, when the number of individuals become quite large and they're distributed among institutions around the world, keeping an accurate record of this is a significant logistical undertaking. Despite the barriers there, conservationists have organized themselves and they have created things called stud books, which are records of the pedigree of an animal. So they have these for many mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, even some fish and invertebrates. But even with a stud book, maintaining genetic variation is more easily said than done, because most institutions only have a small population of any given species. So what this does is it forces the ex situ conservationists to exchange breeding stock and regularly, despite the risks and expenses of shipping organisms from place to place, they need to sort of trade with each other and mate them off to individuals that are from the other side of the world or from other institutions where they haven't already bred with. So zoos, aquariums, and botanic gardens require a great deal of complicated and expensive maintenance, and particularly when they're trying to keep large demanding species, things like black rhinos and killer whales. Ex situ conservation would be a lot easier if species were all small and immobile and they didn't need to be fed or watered. But that kind of thinking is actually what led to ex situ conservation techniques being directed towards different life history stages that are easier for storage. So things like microbes and plant propagules, so seeds, spores, vegetative parts, and even the sperm and embryos of animals. And this is also going to help with genetic variation, because when you're storing sperm, it's a lot easier to transport sperm than it is to transport a whole panda. So it's going to help with going to new places and getting genetic variation. Noah's Ark has been kind of an overused metaphor for ex situ conservation, but it does convey kind of the simplest justification for the practice. So many species would not exist today if they hadn't been taken from the wild and kept in captivity. To be more precise, today there's actually 42 species of plants and 38 species of animal that are extinct in the wild and only survive in captivity. A tree called Franklinia altahama actually disappeared from the wild shortly after its discovery in 1765, but it's persisted in the botanical gardens ever since then. So in contrast, sometimes things will only be in captivity for a short period of time. So like things like the black-footed ferret, which was removed from the wild and kept in safe captive havens for less than 5 years. And that was following that outbreak of distemper that we talked about, and they were eventually released back into the wild. There is still a captive population, but the ones that were taken in were released back. A captive population of the Leon Springs pupfish became the only genetically pure form of its species after the wild population ended up being contaminated through hybridization with an exotic minnow. There's also some animals that were kept in captivity but did not have successful breeding programs, and the last known individual for them actually died in captivity. So we talked about some of these in our extinction lecture, and the most famous ones would be Martha, which is the last passenger pigeon who died in the Cincinnati Zoo in September of 1914. It was about 10 years after her species had vanished from the wild, and less than a century after her species had numbered in the billions. Perhaps some of the species could have been saved by our modern XC2 husbandry, but certainly not all of them, right? We can't save everything. Um, Furthermore, we have to remember that there's a large number of species like blue whales and ivory-billed woodpeckers that have never been able to be maintained in captivity, much less bred there, and they likely never will be. So the limitations of XC2 conservation are particularly evident when we recall that the vast bulk of biodiversity is in things like insects and other small life forms, and they're not kept in captivity. So a very large proportion of our biodiversity on Earth can't be kept in captivity or just isn't. You also have to take into consideration financial limitations. So, for example, it's been estimated that the capacity of world zoos can sustain fewer than 1,000 of the over 20,000 species of mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. So such shortcomings aren't an excuse to abandon XC2 conservation, but it's a reason that we have to shape a realistic evaluation of whether or not it's feasible. So we still need to have XC2 conservation, but we can't expect it to be the save-all for all species or the Noah's Ark where it's, we're saving a little bit of every species. However, there are some species that would probably be extinct today if it weren't for XC2 conservation. Most of the species that you see here in these images disappeared from the wild for some period. And in some places, a few individuals persisted in the wild, but their numbers were so small that they weren't viable. So things like the European bison or the red wolf or the nene goose or the viviparous tree snail, the black-footed ferret, the California condor, the Arabian oryx. They're all things that if it weren't for XC2 conservation, they would have gone extinct most likely. So there is a lot of controversy surrounding XC2 conservation. Some people don't like it for ethical reasons. They would rather see a species just slip into extinction with dignity rather than be subjected to the high-tech meddling that some of the members of the species are going to face in captivity. So many people feel that these species, they're not meant to be captive and that their quality of life in captivity isn't worth keeping a species from going extinct. These feelings rise up particularly with animals. They're not typically something that people express with plants or microbes. And it's even more of an issue with animals that people find charismatic. So people are less concerned about animals like insects. They're more concerned about like birds and mammals. So it kind of comes into our biases there on what we prefer. Also common by criticisms for XC2 are within in situ conservationists. So these are the conservationists that work out in the natural environment. And they feel that XC2 conservation is just too focused on a minority of species. It's too expensive and it's too risky because there's a high incidence of disease in captivity, and there's a really poor success rate for reintroducing captives to the wild. So they think it's just really not worth all of the hassle and the effort. And because XC2 conservation can only focus on animals that are kept in captivity and are able to be kept in captivity, they're really focusing on a small number of species. Perhaps the most problematic is the danger that captive breeding can become kind of a smokescreen to obscure solutions for the real problems. So, for example, it's been claimed that by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife kind of found it easier to support captive breeding projects for black-footed ferrets and California condors than they did to tackle politically difficult problems like the prairie dog eradication and lead poisoning. So they're kind of using it as well, we're helping, but we don't want to tackle the big issues, so this is how we're going to help. That way we can say we did something. The reason this is an issue is because now we're not tackling the root of the problem, right? We're just going for one of the symptoms of the problem, not the root of the problem, which means it's going to cause a lot more issues in the future. So a recent decision by the Chinese government to attempt to clone pandas could also be seen as an attempt to avoid the issue of like habitat conservation. So they're focusing on bringing one species back rather than getting rid of the core of the problem. Arguably, the most controversial ex-situ conservation plan involves the Sumatran rhino. So it's one of the most highly endangered large mammals because of poaching and loss of habitat. And in 1984, ex-situ conservationists initiated a program to establish a captive breeding population. And ultimately, 40 rhinos were caught and held in captivity at a cost of $1 million. To date, they've only had 2 births in this captive population, and the captive population has dwindled to 9 animals from the original 40. And there's actually only 1 pair that's been able to be bred. Not surprisingly, many critics of ex-situ conservation have argued that the time and money should have been spent on better management of the remaining Sumatran rhino habitat. So particularly because all of the species that share this habitat would have also benefited from an in-situ approach. One way to kind of lubricate the friction that can exist between in-situ and ex-situ conservationists is really for zoos and aquariums and botanical gardens to become more directly involved in in-situ conservation and thus escape the constraints of the Noah's Ark metaphor. So some of the largest institutions like the Missouri Botanical Garden or the New England Aquarium, the Bronx Zoo, the Frankfurt Zoo, they all have their own field conservation units operating in a lot of different parts of the globe. And others have formed special relationships with a particular reserve. For example, Zoo Zurich in Switzerland, which has a large exhibit featuring a Madagascar rainforest, actually supports conservation programs in Massawa National Park in eastern Madagascar. So the simplest idea is for zoos, aquariums, and botanical gardens to really use their efforts to raise funds for organizations that undertake in-situ conservation. So it's a way for them to work together and to both help species. So for example, substantial sums could be raised if each visitor were just charged a little bit extra. So you could charge your regular admission and then maybe like a second conservation ticket. And the conservation ticket could cost maybe 20% of regular admission. And people could take this physical conservation ticket that they purchase when they go to a zoo and they can put them in collection boxes that are located all over the zoo. And whatever box they decide to put it in is deciding what type of conservation program their efforts are going to go to. So they can directly decide where their contribution is going to go. So for example, they might have marine mammal conservation next to the sea pool, and maybe support for a conservation group in Mexico in a cactus greenhouse, or a special fund for all the ugly creatures that are usually ignored next to maybe the crocodile exhibit. So no matter where you go in the zoo, you can kind of choose, oh, I want to put my money towards this. And they could buy tickets to put into each of these things. So that's been proposed for a lot of zoos, but it hasn't really been adopted as a program. In the best of all possible worlds, it would never be necessary to have to attempt risky and expensive reintroductions of captive plants and animals. It would be nice if they could just stay in captivity, leading safe and sheltered lives and serving as ambassadors for conservation and education and research. But the scenario is a bit more likely if zoos, aquariums, and botanical gardens become major supporters of in-situ conservation and not just instruments of a last resort or a Noah's Ark. So the next topic that I want to talk about today is how our social factors are influencing our views on conservation. So the attitudes that people have towards other organisms and conservation vary enormously from person to person. While each person's values might be unique, there are patterns that can, to some extent, be explained by culture or religion or gender or income, occupation, age, other factors. And understanding how these factors affect someone's attitude is easier if we use sort of a systematic means to describing their attitudes towards nature. So values change through time, and promoting positive attitudes towards the natural world is a fundamental part of environmental education. By informing people about the importance of biodiversity and encouraging them to experience nature, we can foster attitudes that move us away from the sort of anthropocentric or human-centered view of the world, where it has indifference and destructiveness to wildlife, towards a more biocentric or life-centered perspective that embraces other forms of life in which we share the earth. So many environmental philosophers have argued that if we're going to maintain the Earth's biota, we need a major shift in human values. They believe that we need to move from being anthropocentric to being more biocentric. So a belief in life in all its various forms are the center of the universe versus anthropocentric, where we think that people are the center of the universe. A biocentric view recognizes that all species have intrinsic value, and it rejects the idea that Homo sapiens is a more important species than other species. Without such a change, we might be left cataloging all of the instrumental value of different species and only saving the ones that we find useful. So biocentrism forms the philosophical foundation of biophilia, or love of the biota, love of nature. And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the class. And the term, if you'll remember, was coined by E.O. Wilson, and it was on the basis that the innately emotional affiliation of human beings to other organisms exists. So innate means that it's hereditary and hence a part of our human nature. And the roots of biophilia lie in our own coevolution with nature. And for many millennia, we've depended on nature. In fact, our very survival depended on the intimate knowledge and our connection with wildlife. So it's a compelling hypothesis, and it kind of predicts that human performance and health, even emotional states, are strongly connected to biological diversity. As with most things in life, when ideas about biocentrism and biophilia and anthropocentrism are applied to action, they're not black and white. Even the most extreme preservationists are not likely to be purely biocentric. So if you give them a choice between the survival of humanity and the survival of a small species of snail, no one's going to have to flip a coin, really. Conversely, only a few people would opt to eliminate a life form simply because it's not apparently essential to human welfare. So it's probably better to think of anthropocentrism and biocentrism as two parts of a pole on a continuum. So we need to recognize that it's a complete continuum, and what we need to do is shift more towards the biocentric pole from where we are now. Another way that you can represent this issue is kind of as a nested hierarchy of concern. So you can see that in this image. This is the hierarchy of concern. And in this hierarchy, the lowest, narrowest level of concern is for your own personal well-being. And the highest, broadest level of concern is for the ecosystems and the whole biosphere. So most people have some concern for the welfare of all other humans, and many people care about sentient animals, so those species like mammals and birds that they perceive as having feelings. But raising people's level of concern to embrace all the species and all the ecosystems is essential for conservation biologists to do. So some will argue this can only be done if people become biocentric, but others argue that you can actually have this expanded hierarchy even if you're anthropocentric. So you can care primarily about people, but still also care to reach out and care for other life in other forms. But getting someone to care about nature isn't always the same job, right? So social and cultural differences are huge factors in deciding how to get someone to be interested in conservation. So one of the things you can look at is cultural values and religious values. The cultural diversity that characterizes humanity is one of our greatest assets. It reflects our religious, our ethnic, our racial and linguistic diversity. And at times, however, when universal cooperation is needed, the diversity might seem like a liability or a source of frustration and bafflement. But differences in these cultural values are seen on the world stage most often when human rights are being discussed. And cultural differences and attitudes about non-human organisms is also very pronounced. So we're seeing all of these differences in what people are believing and what people are finding more important based on their culture. So you consider various rodents, things that we call rats, right? In most places, they're loathed as they're the epitome of vermin. We hate them, right? That's a lot of the US. That's how we are. But in several parts of the world, they're relished as food. In Nigerian markets, grass cutter rats sell for more than beef and pork. And in India, some rats are fed and protected in certain temples. Another example is insects. Many people find insects generally disgusting. But an estimated 2,000 species of insects serve as food for people around the world. In North America and in Europe, dogs are beloved companions, but in East Asian countries, they're actually prized as food. So similar stories could be told for many other species like bats, snakes, whales, ravens, more. The list goes on and on. So we often explain these differences with a simple statement as just, oh, it's just their culture. But for example, Hindus will consider cows to be sacred and they won't eat them because that is their culture, right? However, that type of statement isn't really an explanation for why things are that way. So, an anthropologist named Marvin Harris, he wrote a book called Cows, Pigs, War, and Witches, The Riddles of Culture. And he argues that usually all of these cultural ideas have a rational, ecological based explanation behind them. So, for example, he argues that Jewish and Islamic scriptures actually have them not eat pigs based on the fact that these religions originated in desert environments where raising pigs will require a higher quality diet compared to sheep, goats, and cattle is a waste of limited resources. So it's just not worth the resources where this religion originated. So it became something that they now, as part of their culture, it's been solidified, and they don't eat pork. So even though it came from a specific ecological reason, these things can persist over time, and the original reason will disappear and it will become a part of a culture. So it becomes part of their cultural identity. Another type of social difference that comes with its own tendencies towards nature is whether you live in an urban or rural area. So living in a city and living in the country are profoundly different experiences. Many people are quite isolated from the natural world that lies outside of their cities. And this limit can change their understanding of nature. So such isolation in cities can often lead to things like apathy that may be broken only by an event with a direct impact. So, for example, if water rationing were imposed because deforestation had ruined the city's watershed. Of course, none of these things are the case of everyone raised in a city. Actually, many of the world's most common naturalists and conservationists have deep roots in urban areas. But it's tempting to speculate that for some people, their day-to-day distance from nature has given them kind of a stronger appreciation for nature. So sort of like a distance makes the heart grow fonder type thing. Nevertheless, in general, people are more likely in rural communities to understand the relationship with the natural world. And in part, that's really just because they will be more directly affected by any problems that arise, and they're also exposed to the natural world more. And this is particularly true for people who depend on wildlife for their well being. So, the understanding such people develop, known in some circles as traditional ecological knowledge or TEK, it encompasses more than a set of information. It kind of shapes their values and their systems and their worldviews. So TEK is also a productive springboard for initiating conservation efforts in both forests and marine environments. Now, that isn't to say that all rural people are in touch with nature and respect it, while urban people are separated from nature and don't understand it. That's not what I want you to get from this, because that's not necessarily true. Through farming, fishing, logging, and similar activities, many rural people interact with other species and have a strong utilitarian or instrumental value towards them. So, utilitarian attitudes aren't a threat as long as the species in question can sustain the usage. But sometimes these attitudes are extended to species that are too uncommon to be exploited. And a lot of the time, people who are relying on these resources to live are unwilling to change their ways, even if it means it's going to lead to the collapse of a population or the extinction of a species. So think of like the Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon. Those are really common examples of something like this that happened. Similarly, people from urban areas around the world are more likely to write politicians and give money to conservation programs to save things like rainforests in the Amazon. However, for the poor people who live there, establishing parks impedes their ability to hunt for game or even or cut the forest to grow crops. So in these cases, the isolation of urban people actually makes it easier for them to advocate for biodiversity, but the reason for it is because it costs them so little to do so. Whereas the people in rural areas, it costs them more to advocate for the the increase of biodiversity because they are physically losing things from having to change their lifestyle. So to kind of make a summary generalization, rural people's attitudes towards wildlife, both positive and negative, are likely to be pragmatic attitudes based on regular interactions with nature. On the other hand, the attitudes of urban people, positive, negative, and apathetic alike, are likely to be more conceptual and removed from direct experience. So where these distinctions become important is in things like geopolitical regions, where urban voters will outnumber rural voters in conservation matters. So this can affect primarily rural areas, but urban voters have more of a say. So this was recently a case when they proposed the reintroduction of the wolves to wilderness areas of New York State Adirondack Park. So this is an action that was favored by urban and suburban dwellers, but it was not embraced by residents of the reintroduction area. So these are things that we need to take into account when we're coming up with our laws and when we're coming up with things that we need to change, whether or not we're going to be affecting the people in the rural areas to an extent that they're not going to be able to survive. But we also need to find that balance, right? We don't want to say, oh, well, because you guys won't like it, we're not going to do any conservation stuff in your area. We need to find that balance, which is similar to what happened with Yellowstone National Park, right? There was outcry when we re-released the wolves. There's still people that are adamant that these wolves are terrible to have around. But you have to weigh the costs and benefits and decide whether it's worth the issues that it may cause, or whether it's not worth it to even reintroduce the species or to have this conservation measure. So another type of role that changes whether or not we value or how we value nature is gender. There's been a lot of anecdotal and mythological connections of women to nature, and many cultures refer to nature as female. So, for example, Mother Nature. And care for nature has been suggested to be linked to values in nurturing and caring for others, which historically was associated with females. Although in reality, it's a quality, any person can have it. It doesn't matter what gender you are. This is just the main reason that they ascribed female female names to nature. It was just because of that connection. So, but beyond the romantic and mythological notions of the connections between women and nature, the fact remains that women play a pivotal role in maintaining biological diversity and developing knowledge of its use through wild resources. Many of the leading conservationists that we've seen have been women. So, for example, Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring and informed the public on the dangers of pesticide use. Jane Goodall, who's been instrumental in the conservation of chimpanzees. Molly Beatty, who was the first female director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and oversaw the reintroduction of the gray wolf into the northern Rocky Mountains. She also helped create 15 national wildlife refuges. And the list goes on and on. There's a ton of women who have been huge in the conservation era. Beyond differences in attitudes towards nature in general, men and women also differ in how they value particular species. In many rural parts of southern Africa, men are primarily the hunters of large mammals, whereas women are more interacting with a broader array of wildlife. So they'll gather wild plants for food, for fuel and fiber. They'll get medicine, they'll catch birds, reptiles, fish, insects, small mammals for food. And it's kind of interesting to speculate that the tendency of conservationists focuses heavily on large mammals. And in part, you have to wonder whether that's kind of a reflection of it still being a male-dominated culture and the relationship between men and large mammals that stretches back to our earliest ancestors. There's also additional perspectives that we can look at that have cultural and social differences between groups of people and how they view nature. So you can look at things like attitudes about nature influenced by age, occupation, income, education, other factors. So given all this complexity, a lot of the times it's really hard to determine why people feel the way they do. You might say like, oh, well, she's a woman, or he's, from America, or he's 25, so he's rather young, so that's why they have this view. But there's so many things going on at once that we really don't know what necessarily causes each person to have a certain way. But they have done some studies to determine general trends in each of these categories. So of course it does not encompass everybody. It's just a trend. And a lot of the times it's hard to describe how you value things, which makes it hard to determine really like where you lie in all of these different variations in social and cultural beliefs. So, for example, how do you feel about snakes, right? Do they frighten you? Do they fascinate you? Do you love them? Do your parents feel the same way that you do? So discussion about human values can be kind of fuzzy because they're difficult to describe systematically. So one person may say, oh, I hate snakes. Another person says the same thing, but they don't actually hate them in the same way. Or if they both love them, they don't love them in the same way. So it's hard to describe and make it a really systematic approach. So a sociologist named Stephen Kellert, who works on conservation issues, actually spent many years developing systematic techniques for describing how people feel about animals, especially wild animals. And then he used them to better understand how the values differ among people of different ages, education, employment, culture, race, gender, religion, and so on. So he was the one that was really defining these differences in social structures. So the basic method that he used was to read statements to people and ask them to strongly agree, slightly disagree, or strongly disagree. And by scoring their responses to statements like things like, I have owned pets that were as dear to me as another person, or if I were going camping, I would prefer to stay in a modern campground rather than in an isolated spot where there might be wild animals around. So he would use questions like that, and he would score each answer. And by scoring these, he identified several basic types of attitudes towards animals. So here's the list of attitudes that he came up with. He came up with 10 different attitudes. So there was naturalistic, which is showing an interest in and the affection for wild animals in the outdoors, and that's seen in 10% of people. Ecologistic, which is being concerned with ecosystems, particularly the interrelationships between species and their habitats. Humanistic, which is showing a strong affection for the individual animals such as pets and large wild animals. Usually a strong tendency for anthropomorphism also. Moralistic, which is when you're concerned with the ethical treatment of animals. So you're strongly opposed to cruelty towards animals or presumed overexploitation. Then there's scientific, which is actually the lowest category with 1% of people, which is an intellectual interest in organisms as biological entities. Then you have aesthetic, which is when you're interested in the physical attractiveness and symbolic characteristics of animals. Utilitarian, which is when you're interested in the practical value of animals and their habitats. Dominionistic, which is when you're interested in the mastery and control of animals, typically in things like sporting situations. Negativistic, which is the preferring to actively avoid animals because of a dislike or a fear. And then neutralistic, preferring to passively avoid animals because of a lack of interest. So it's kind of a scale of being either very into nature or really not at all. So survey data of that type, it singled out many generations made about how values differ among cultures. So it could be between cultures, rural and urban people, women and men, all of these things were used in this study. And he was able to identify that women ascribe greater preservation value to non-human species. They express greater concern for species conservation relative to property rights, and they seek stronger support for endangered species protection. Similarly, people of rural areas, defined as like towns with less than 500 people, tend to have high scores for utilitarian and naturalistic attitudes, whereas urban people from populations greater than 1 million show higher scores for moralistic and humanistic attitudes. They were also able to contrast attitudes towards wild animals among Western cultures. So in a cross-cultural comparison of the United States, Japan, and Germany, the most notable results were that there were higher scores for moralistic and ecological attitudes in the United States and for dominionistic attitudes in Japan. Data from Germany revealed that they had extremely high scores for moralistic attitudes and relatively low scores for dominionistic and utilitarian attitudes. And as a generalization, people in all three countries cared more about the welfare of individual species of wild animals, typically species with strong aesthetic and cultural and historic associations, than they did about broader, more conceptual entities like ecosystems or biodiversity. So these results help to really explain why the public often seems to prefer concentrated efforts to conserve a few high-profile species rather than the coarse filter approach where we're conserving a whole bunch of things, the whole environment. Even though the coarse filter approach has an obvious efficiency to it, people prefer to protect the species that they're interested in. So these techniques can also be used to try to understand how people feel about biodiversity in general. So what they did is they compared people's attitudes towards different groups of endangered species in the United States, and respondents rated their favorability towards various taxonomic groups on a scale of 0 as the lowest favorability to 100 as highest. And what ended up happening is we had a first tier consisting of plants with a score of 72 out of 100, birds with a score of 71, and mammals with a score of 71. Then the second tier of importance was fish at 68. Third tier was reptiles at 59, amphibians at 59, and invertebrates at 57. And the fourth tier that people kind of didn't really care about as much were microorganisms at 52. So in an extension of this work, researchers examined if these attitudes were consistent with how we allocate our funds for conservation, and they found something interesting. They found that they were generally pretty consistent. So with the exception of amphibians and plants, which are actually gravely underfunded relative to their positive values that people gave them here, our conservation efforts really go towards the thing that people value higher. But values change, right? So a quote worth remembering is that the only thing that never changes is the fact that everything changes. And a few millennia ago, when daily life revolved around being predators and grazers and avoiding becoming prey, ecologistic and utilitarian values towards wildlife would have been really widespread. And neutralistic and attitudes were virtually unknown. Even looking back just a few decades can reveal some of the remarkable changes in values. So not very long ago, attitudes towards whales and wolves were shaped by things like Moby Dick and Little Red Riding Hood. And at best, those creatures were considered irrelevant to the lives of most people. At worst, they actually were the embodiment of evil. But today, attitudes towards whales and wolves seem to be much more positive. Dramatic photographs and evocative recordings of songs and howls from these animals were transformed. They kind of transformed these creatures into more of a symbol of power, and they're a popular symbol of the human assault on nature and conservation. So if you belong to a conservation group, you've probably seen countless advertisements for merchandise of like jewelry, mugs, t-shirts with whales and wolves on them. And whales and wolves have seemingly become kind of sacred totems for thousands of people. Amphibians are another good example. For centuries, people viewed them with indifference. They did not care about amphibians at all. But now they're a huge focus for wildlife conservation, and they're a huge focus of concern. So these changes can occur pretty quickly. Our values can change within a community, but they can also occur with even just a single individual. So for example, you guys have been reading, you read some of a Sam County Almanac. During his early career, Aldo Leopold never passed up the chance to kill a wolf, right? And later in life, the wolf became a symbol of wilderness for him. So reflecting on his youth, he described the death of a wolf that he had shot in the chapter Thinking Like a Mountain. So you may remember this quote from your readings. It says, "We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and I've known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean a hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf or the mountain agreed with such a view." So from this one instance in his life, he was able to completely shift his values, and he was able to realize that he needed to change. And he knew that he was doing wrong. So we can shift our values just within an individual as well as within an entire community. If we're to maintain the Earth's biodiversity, values have to change in the future, even more than they've changed in the past few decades. In Kellert's terminology, attitudes towards wildlife that are naturalistic or ecologistic, or aesthetic and moralistic must become stronger, whereas negativistic, neutralistic, and dominionistic and utilitarian values have to decrease. So trying to sensitize people to the values of nature is a routine exercise for environmentalists in particular. It's a central part of environmental education. And there's a quote by an ecologist named Baba Diawam that perfectly summarizes this sentiment. He said, "For in the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught." So environmental education can shift people's attitudes towards nature through two basic modes. You can do it through information and through experience. If we give people information about the instrumental value of biodiversity and about how important it is to the welfare of humanity and the biosphere in general, then people will probably place a higher value on it. Millions of people around the world now think of tropical rainforests as a storehouse of medicinal plants and pivotal components of global climatic processes, rather than just like bug-infested jungles. So simply because they were given the information about it. That said, more education is not as simple as it sounds. In fact, often individuals with the greatest factual knowledge, so for example, rural people with direct contact and deep familiarity of endangered wild carnivores, might express the most negative attitudes towards them. Experience, though, can actually shape people's values too. And environmental educators often try to get people outdoors where they can interact with the local biota. So, not surprisingly, Kellert's research found that people who participated in outdoor nature-related activities, ranging from bird watching to fur trapping, had higher naturalistic and ecologistic scores than those that did not. People who have encountered organisms in their natural environment may also find it easier to accept the idea that they have intrinsic value. Even indirect exposure through wolves and whale paraphernalia, for example, might help to shape values. So Kellert found that watching nature shows even on television was positively correlated with naturalistic and ecologistic attitudes. And that's how I spent the majority of my last 7 years of my life. I've been educating the public and giving them experiences with nature that they might not have ever had, and it's an amazing tool for getting people interested. I can't tell you how many people I met who told me I completely changed their view on a particular species. So especially like the ones that people tend to have an aversion to, so things like snakes and opossums. Just simply being exposed to these animals kind of can change people's whole view on them. And they can see them as more of a living creature rather than the negative things that they hear about on the internet or they've just had in their mind from their culture. A number of frameworks have been developed to assign economic values to species as well. So this is for species, ecosystems, and even genetic variability. You can assign economic value to all of these things. And it can be done on about 3 levels. So you can have the marketplace or harvest value of resources. You can have the value provided by unharvested resources in their natural state, and then the future value of resources. So for example, we can assign an economic value to the Southeast Asian wild boar. This is a wild relative of our domestic cattle. So we can do it based on the meat currency of the harvested individuals from the wild populations. We can also do it on the animal's value in the wild for nature tourism. And we can look at its value for its future potential in domestic cattle breeding programs. So there's 3 different levels. Use values of biodiversity are directly divided between direct use values and indirect use values. So there's no real universal accepted framework for assigning values to biodiversity, but there's a variety of approaches that have been proposed. And the most useful framework used by McNeely and Barbier um, is which economic values are first divided into these use and non-use values. So direct use values, which are a type of use value, obviously, are products that are harvested by people. So things like timber, seafood, medicinal plants from the wild. While indirect use values are benefits provided by the biodiversity of an organism. So they don't involve harvesting or destroying the resource. And you can see examples of each of these below in this diagram of the use and non-use values that you can get from this this pond. So option value is also a part of indirect use value, and it's determined by the prospect of future benefits for human society. So things like new medicines or possible future food sources, future genetic resources. And then you have existence value, and this is the non-use value that can be assigned for biodiversity. So, for example, economists can attempt to measure how much people are willing to pay for a protected species from going extinct, or from an ecosystem from being destroyed. So, a category of existence value, which is now how much people are willing to pay to protect something for their children or their future generations. The combination of all of these values can be used to calculate the total economic value of biodiversity. So you really would combine all four of these categories. You would have your direct use values, your indirect use values, your option values, and your existence values. And you combine them all, and that would be your overall value of a species or an ecosystem. So it's important to recognize the true costs and benefits associated with wise natural resource management. And it's led to a kind of paradigm shift in many circles. A lot of people are no longer asking things like, can we afford to conserve this? But now we're asking, can we afford not to conserve it? Because we have really changed the environment in such a way that a lot of our things are really, can we afford to not help this? Or it's going to be such an issue if we don't. So the costs of maintaining biodiversity can kind of be divided into two major types. You have your explicit costs for environmental technology, salaries for people who undertake projects that maintain and restore biodiversity. And then you have your implicit costs, which is just the loss of the potential benefits when conservation means that you're giving up something, giving up the opportunity to use a resource. So from an economic perspective, a fundamental problem with maintaining biodiversity is that there's often an imbalance between who pays for maintaining biodiversity and who enjoys the benefits. So we all enjoy the goods and services provided by biodiversity, but often the costs of maintaining biodiversity fall disproportionately on rural people and on developing nations that have the richest biodiversity. So when we're deciding what to focus on, we have to take into account the costs. Both, for example, a date palm and a tiny mite living in a crack on the palm's bark might be equal in the eyes of people who believe that every life has intrinsic value. But however, intrinsic values don't eliminate or validate the instrumental values, and instrumental values are still there. They're profoundly influencing the way that most people view the date palms and the mites. And that's because instrumental values are readily transformed into economic values. And people can relate these economic values to their daily life. So the phrase money makes the world go round really hints at the central role of economics in all of human endeavors, and that's including conservation. So you can consider the World Conservation Union's definition of conservation here. The definition is the management of human use of the biosphere so that it may yield the greatest sustainable benefit to present generations while maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of future generations. So these certainly sound more like the words of an economist than the words of a biologist. So they remind us of the need to have a solid grounding in economics. And if you want to be a true conservation biologist, you really need to understand how economics comes into play here. Coal, copper, and gold are fundamentally different from cod, ducks, and oaks in the eyes of economists. And they see the world as a collection of resources that we're able to exploit for the benefit of people. The first three things I just listed are non-renewable resources. So these are supplies which are finite and are exhaustible. The latter three are renewable resources. So they will inevitably replenish themselves, or they can replenish themselves, and they can last indefinitely if we use them wisely. Most renewable resources are living biological resources, but some are non-living resources. So things like clean air and water, for example. Quantifying the values of renewable resources is often more difficult than quantifying the values of non-renewable resources, because a cod isn't just an inert commodity waiting to be extracted and sold at market value. It's a living thing. It's dynamic, mobile, interacting, and often interacting in unpredictable ways with many other species. So for economists, it's really about goods and services. Goods are physical objects that you can purchase, own, and use, while services are labor that is performed for your benefits. And often strong tensions arise when those that are asked to bear the costs of protecting biodiversity don't receive any of these goods and services or any benefits that they can see. So here, for example, this person has anger towards the restrictions on logging in governmental-owned forests in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, which were designed to protect the spotted owl under the Endangered Species Act. So they actually sell bumper stickers that say things like, "I love spotted owls fried," and "Caution, I swear for small animals, they're harder to hit." So things like that, it causes tension in local communities when they're not getting the perceived goods and services that they think they deserve for the the costs that they're having to deal with. And another issue that comes into play with economics is that many biological resources are communally owned, and thus the costs of overexploitation and degradation are shared by a lot of people, whereas the benefits of overexploitation are taken largely by the people who are doing the overexploiting. So if you're familiar with the essay entitled "The Tragedy of the Commons," you'll realize that it's kind of a situation that tends to compel overexploitation. But the tragedy of the commons is an economic problem in which every individual has an incentive to consume a resource. But when they consume a resource, it's at the expense of every other individual, with no way of excluding anyone from consuming. So this phenomenon is particularly pervasive in aquatic ecosystems, especially in oceans where private ownership is rare. And most parts of the oceans and in Antarctica, ownership is not even claimed by nations, let alone by individuals or corporations. So the tragedy of the commons dilemma is also applicable to biodiversity in general. So if you think of things like genes and species as commonly owned assets, from this perspective, you may own individual sequoia trees growing on your land at this time, but the sequoia as a species is owned by everyone on Earth as part of a global biological heritage. And if sequoias were to become extinct, we would lose all of something. we would all lose something. However, the people who drove the species to extinction are actually probably gaining from that because they are the ones that are using the sequoia for goods and services. So they might gain more than they lost, and thus they would be acting consistently with their self-interest. So communally owned natural resources are highly vulnerable to degradation through overuse. So to make it easier to understand, I'm going to use a scenario. So let's say we have an English village and it has a tract of pasture that's used by all of the farmers in this area of the village. They let all of their cattle graze there. Now imagine this common area that can support 25 cattle without being degraded, and that currently there's 5 farmers using the commons. So each of these different colors represents the 5 cattle for each of the 5 different farmers. So each farmer owns 5 cows, and each of these cows can produce, let's say on average, 10 kilograms of milk per day. So the total milk production of the commons average is going to be about 250 kilograms per day, and the production for each farmer is going to be 50 kilograms per day. So right now they're all getting an equal pay for their cows. But let's imagine now that one day one of the farmers considers buying another cow and thus increasing their herd to 6 cows, and the commons herd is now increased to 26 cows. So they know that now they're pushing above the carrying capacity of the commons, and by doing that, their average milk production per cow is going to go down. So let's assume it falls by 5%. So we go down to 9.5 kilograms per day now per cow. So should this farmer buy an extra cow, even though it's going to reduce the productivity from every other cow? And if she's acting in the terms of her own immediate economic interest, she should, because her cow's daily milk production is going to increase from 50 to 57 kilograms, because she has now 6 cows with 9.5 kilograms each instead of 5 cows with 10 kilograms each. Unfortunately, the average milk production of the other 4 farmers is going to fall now to 47.5 kilograms per day because the pasture can only sustain so much. So they're going to have 5 cows at 9.5, dropping it to 47.5. Now, imagine that one of the other farmers decides, well, he needs more than 47.5 kilograms per day. So he decides he's going to buy another cow too. And even though the average production per cow is going to fall again to 9 kilograms per day, this is going to make economic sense for him because his production is going to be at 54 kilograms per day, which is much better than what he was getting before. So now everyone with 5 cows is only getting 45 kilograms per day. So this pattern can continue to snowball until all of the farmers have 6 cows, and now everyone is only getting 45 kilograms of milk per day, which is 5 kilograms less than the original that they had when they all had 5 cows. And now they have to take care of 6 cows instead of 5. So even though the numbers we used here were made to make it kind of simplified, in a hypothetical example, the tragedy of the commons is real. People will act in their own self-interest many times, even when it's negatively impacting the community. So this is really well illustrated in places like fisheries, where each fisher buys more equipment and works longer hours to catch a larger share of fish. And the reason they need to work longer hours and get this more equipment is because the fish population is dwindling, because they're getting more and more and they're being overexploited. So it's kind of like a snowball effect where it just keeps getting worse and worse and we keep pushing it. So it remains a problem on areas like communal grazing land, just like the example in many countries. It also underlies one problem with ecotourism, where tour guides will take their clients closer and closer to wild animals. So they're assuring a good trip for their for the people that they are showing around, and probably a really good tip from them as well, so making more money, until they end up actually getting so close to the animals that they're negatively impacting them and making it harder for future times. Um, so, although the classic image of a commons is a communal resource that everyone consumes, we can also think of a commons as like a communal place where everyone puts his or her wastes, such as the Earth's atmosphere or the water on Earth. In both cases, each individual is acting in accord with his or her own short-term economic interest. So they're degrading the long-term economic well-being of everyone because they're benefiting in the moment. So that comes into play a lot when we're talking about solutions for coming up with solutions for pollution and habitat degradation. And a lot of the times we're unwilling to sacrifice something for future generations because right now we're getting some sort of benefit. And we don't want to have to pay any costs. So there have been some suggested solutions to the tragedy of the commons. Passing and enforcing laws are the standard ways of ensuring that people don't harm society as a whole while acting in their own self-interest. And laws are designed to protect biodiversity, and they're pretty widespread, a lot of these designs. So, nevertheless, new laws and better enforcement of existing laws are still needed. And the regulatory approach to protecting global biotic heritage becomes quite complex when species concerned are mobile and cross political boundaries. In such cases, international laws or treaties are required. And international treaties designed to protect migratory birds have been moderately successful in terms of curbing overhunting, although they've done little to stem habitat loss. So we're not necessarily covering everything. A major advantage of international coordination is that you can make the regulatory approach to maintaining biodiversity fairer. So you can do that by compelling all of the businesses that are competing for the same market to internalize the environmental costs of doing business. So you're making it fair by making everyone have the same costs. Furthermore, if collaboration fails, a government could act unilaterally by imposing ecological tariffs. And this could increase the cost of goods that are imported from any country where environmental costs are not internalized. However, this approach kind of runs headlong against the World Trade Organizations and the general agreement of tariffs and trade, which require international agreements on any environmental constraints to free trade. So it's something that's pretty controversial. Arguably, the general agreement of tariffs and trade could work for biodiversity conservation by eliminating the perverse subsidies that governments pay to prop up unsustainable economic activity. So such subsidies typically lead to the overharvest of natural resources because they sustain the harvest long after the market would make it unprofitable to continue. This being said, in practice, powerful nations often succeed in protecting their use of subsidies despite agreeing to the principal trade agreements and treaties. So money gets you everything. Another problem with economics of conservation is when biodiversity maintenance generates an implicit cost by reducing opportunities to use resources. This cost often falls on relatively few people, especially poor people in rural areas. And this is actually something that I know some people pointed out with the video for Racing Extinction on how a lot of this seemed like it was being blamed on people in poor areas who have nothing else to do, right? It's not, it shouldn't all be put on them. There is a lot being perpetuated by the areas with a lot of money. So the richest parts of our planet in terms of biodiversity are often the poorest economically. And the image of poor farmers trying to scratch out a living by clearing garden patches in tropical forests is kind of a dramatic example of the widespread discrepancy between biotic and economic wealth. So these situations are full of unfairness. If the government establishes a new national park to protect, let's say, gorilla habitat from encroachment by local farmers, it's going to cost the fans of gorillas virtually nothing, maybe a few cents each day if they pay an annual membership fee to the international conservation group that's supporting the project. But for a couple that's living in the village on the border of the proposed park and looking for land where they can start a farm and a family, and the establishment of this park is going to put severe constraints on all of their opportunities. So if we want to combat this, maintaining biodiversity must be everyone's responsibility. And therefore, we have to share part of the burden. Sometimes this will require a net flow of funds from a society as a whole to those people who experience the costs of maintaining the Earth's biota most directly. Within single government, this redistribution of funds is relatively easy because governments have many mechanisms for subsidizing activities that are deemed to be in the public interest. So, for example, property taxes on lands that are managed to maintain their ecological values can be reduced or waived. Or they can subsidize prices that can be paid for carefully harvested commodities. Conservation groups and governments often purchase something called conservation easements from private landowners. And this is a legal mechanism by which landowners give up certain property rights for certain conservation purposes. So typically what they're doing is they're selling their right to develop on their own property. So these permanent conservation easements often cost over 80% of the regular price of a tract of land. And they keep landowners from developing on the land because they're performing some sort of conservation value. So maybe it has some sort of habitat that an endangered species is in, but if a person already owns the property, they'll have a conservation easement where the person will get paid to just not touch that part of their property and leave it to nature. Sometimes specific ecological services can actually be purchased on an annual basis. So conservation easements are rapidly growing as a means of extended limited conservation funding. So it's used to protect even larger amounts of land. Sharing the burden internationally is a little bit more difficult. And one innovative way of generating funds by international conservation groups is through a debt for nature swaps program. So debt for nature swaps are financial transactions in which a portion of a developing nation's foreign debt is forgiven in exchange for local investments in environmental conservation measures. So things like environmental education and better management of protected areas. So they'll refuse some of the debt of the country in order to facilitate their use of conservation measures. So there's also growing interest in allowing industries to produce greenhouse gases. To compensate for this activity, they pay for maintaining forests where carbon can be sequestered, especially in places like tropical forests in developing countries. So it's kind of like a payment for the issues that you're causing. You're releasing greenhouse gases, well, now you have to pay money to create something to get rid of the greenhouse gases that you created. That's pretty much how they'll do it. Probably the best way to offset the losses experienced by people who share their land with wildlife is really to find ways to increase the benefits that they receive from the local biota. This idea is that it's kind of the basis for what's often called community-based conservation or integrated conservation and development projects. And conservationists often promote ecotourism with this. So ecotourism is when you have people come to an area to simply see nature or spend time in nature, interact with nature, instead of degrading or destroying ecosystems and harvesting animals. But it has some problems. For example, it can lead to significant environmental degradation still. Some people don't like working for demanding tourists, so they just simply don't want to do it. Also, a lot of the money in ecotourism goes to foreign-owned airlines and hotel chains and tour companies rather than to the local people who need it the most. However, if you do it properly with careful planning and significant local involvement and control measures, ecotourism can produce significant benefits for local people while still not harming the ecological community. So improving markets for local products based on sustainable use of wildlife is another way to offset costs. For example, several organizations encourage consumers to purchase tropical hardwoods that have been sustainably harvested by local people. And these people will have an incentive then to use their forests sustainably since they want to keep collecting on this for as long as possible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about politics and how it comes into things. Politics have a huge say in what we conserve and how we conserve it. The interface between conservation and politics is a complex landscape that can be explored in a lot of different ways. First, it has to be recognized that politics and action inevitably occur within severe constraints on the resources available for conservation work. So mainly this is constraints on time and constraints on money. Next, we have to determine who has the rights and responsibilities for conserving biodiversity. Conservationists understand the finite natural resources that humans overexploit, and so it's easy for us to appreciate the resources available for conservation work. But why do we spend far, far more money on things like medical research and treatment rather than controlling environmental pollution when many diseases are primarily symptoms of environmental degradation? Even within a conservation context, why do we end up paying dearly for last-minute interventions to save a species on the brink of extinction when it would have been easier and cheaper to maintain the species habitat years ago? Inevitably, we have to work with what society gives us, and that's often really minimal. So there are a lot of approaches to settling the priorities and figuring out what we're going to do through what we want to prioritize. So the main question here is, how do we know what to focus on? And one thing we can look at is the level of biodiversity that we can protect. If we give priority to protecting a marsh from being destroyed, then we'll protect hundreds, even thousands of different species that inhabit that marsh. This is the essential idea behind the coarse filter that we talked about a few times. So this is the coarse filter approach to maintain biodiversity. In contrast, if we give priority to protecting a single species through the fine filter, we may be helping only that one species, or maybe only a few other species with which it's closely associated. So most conservation biologists recognize the general wisdom of focusing on organizing conservation around ecosystems. But sometimes there is still debates on the merits of ecosystems versus species as targets of conservation. And that largely just stems from the fact that species are more easily recognized as biological entities. And there are a lot of species that we are more closely, we care a lot more about them than we do about entire ecosystems. So if someone told you, oh, well, mangrove ecosystems are going extinct, and someone said the panda's going extinct, a lot of people are going to be more up in arms about the panda because it's something they're familiar with. We can also look at geographic scales. So conservationists need to ask at what geographic scale is a species or ecosystem at risk. And then giving priority to those at jeopardy at large scales is important. So especially like the global scale, if they're at risk in the global scale, that's when you would give them priority. So this relates back to, if you'll remember in our diversity lecture, about alpha, beta, and gamma diversity. So this is something we went over earlier in the class, and often this is ignored when looking at conservation, but it's something that's so important. Wealthy countries often spend large sums protecting species that are threatened within their borders, but are globally secure. On the other hand, it's not a complete waste of time or money to save species that are in danger of local extirpation. So maintaining species across the entire geographic range is necessary if you want its complete genetic wealth to be maintained. Locally endangered species can also be important because of their ecological or economic or strategic roles. But nevertheless, the Earth's biodiversity as a whole is usually better served if we could take a truly global perspective when setting priorities. And this will require looking beyond political boundaries so that so often that we constrain our thinking. We also have to decide what areas to protect. And for deciding areas, there's kind of 5 criteria that come in here. So we have the size and number. So we need both more and larger reserves, but we're often forced to choose between these goals. We also need representativeness. So the coarse filter approach requires conserving an array of ecosystems that characterize a region, or a fine filter perspective is a complete array of a species habitat. So maybe you're just protecting all of the habitats one species would be in. We also look at rarity. So the areas that support rare ecosystems, like aquatic ecosystems in the midst of an arid region, or habitat for rare or threatened species, are a clear priority. We also take into account condition. So relatively pristine areas are usually preferred over areas that have been substantially degraded. Although exceptions do occur. For example, when purchasing forest land, conservationists might prefer to buy 1,000 hectares of recently logged forest if the same amount of money would buy them only 300 hectares of mature forest. So it's, again, that cost and benefit coming in. And then finally, threat. So a reserve that is isolated from potential sources of disruption will be easier to maintain, although conservationists sometimes give higher priority to areas that are likely to be threatened by human activities in the foreseeable future. Now, this isn't everything that we can look at. We can add cost, fragility, feasibility, urgency, even more. There's a ton of other things we can look at, but these are just like the main 5 things we look at when we're choosing areas. We also have the hard decision of choosing species. So blue whales or redwoods, black rhinos or white rhinos. You could list dozens of factors that you need to consider when choosing which species to receive priority. But we're going to address just 2 overarching questions. And those questions are, which species is more valuable? and which species is at greater risk of extinction. If our primary concern is the welfare of humanity, then we should favor species with economic value. And because people are dependent on healthy ecosystems, species with important ecological roles as dominant or keystone species would also be favored. If our concern is more equitability and distributing resources among all species, then we should focus on species with important ecological roles because so many other species depend on them. For the same reason, we should give priority to flagship and umbrella species that have strategic value to conservation action. People usually favor a species with realized value over one that has only potential value. Finally, the uniqueness of a species also amplifies all of their other values. If we lose a species like the African elephant, its role isn't going to be easily filled by other species. So then our second question was, which species is at a greater risk of extinction? And this is also a key issue, especially if you believe that all species have intrinsic value. Intuitively, this seems to be a simple issue, right? So species that are at greater risk of extinction should receive higher priority. However, some conservationists have advocated for more of a triage approach to dealing with species. What this is triage refers to the idea that there are three classes of war casualties. So you have people who will recover without immediate medical aid, people who will die even if given aid, and then people for whom aid is a life or death matter. And in this approach, priority is given to the third group of casualties, the ones that aid is a life or death matter. And similarly, priority is given to species that have a reasonable chance of surviving if given attention. So species that will die anyway are sometimes phased out and left to become extinct because there's the idea that there's nothing that we can really do about it. So many conservation biologists have difficulty with deliberately abandoning a species to extinction. On the other hand, one could argue that sending 4 biologists to Brazil to save, for example, the Spix's macaw after it was apparently reduced to a single wild bird might have been overreacting to a lost cause, because if there's only one bird, nothing you can do, right? Another level that we need to decide what to focus on is choosing nations. And international organizations decide what countries should receive assistance with their efforts to conserve biodiversity. Some relevant issues have already been discussed, like hotspots, but notably determining what countries harbor the most endangered or economic species, or which countries are in the greatest danger of losing their natural populations is a big part of this. Similar processes can be used to prioritize among biogeographic units like ecoregions or biomes that reflect species distributions better than political units. Other issues have little to do with biology. So which countries have sufficient political stability to make ambitious conservation projects feasible? Which nations have the greatest financial need for assistance? Money spent in an unstable country is less likely to be effectively used than in a more stable country like Costa Rica. Conservationists in Swaziland are more likely to need external subsidy than those in Sweden. So expertise sometimes is given to, or sometimes that's what's needed. So nations like Saudi Arabia, which suffer from a shortage of ecologists, they have the money to pay the salaries, they just don't have the people, they don't have the expertise there. So that would disqualify them from a lot of these talks about who deserves the aid. One analysis recommended that nations for that recommended nations for conservation effort after explicitly incorporating the estimated cost of creating and maintaining a reserve network covering 15% of the nation's area. So when they looked at 15% of the nation's area, they looked at the cost to create and maintain a reserve. And when cost effectiveness was added to the formula, countries where conservation is going to be relatively expensive moved down on the priority list. So countries like the United States and like Australia, they moved down on the priority list because our conservation is expensive, while countries like Peru and Malaysia rose higher. Another important choice that we need to make is choosing tasks. So projects designed to maintain biodiversity can often be divided into two broad classes of activities. So you can have protecting ecosystems that are already threatened versus restoring ecosystems and restoring species that have been degraded or locally extirpated. So which one of these is more important? That's one of the big questions. Of course, there's no actual answer to that because there's a ton of factors that come into play. But there is a generalization that it's almost always easier to protect what exists rather than to restore what's been lost. So consequently, for a given level of effort, the impact of a protection project is usually greater than the impact of a restoration project. We can also address the issue of choosing tasks by examining the four basic parts of the most complex human undertakings. So these are the planning phase, which is when you figure out what you want to do and how to do it. The implementation phase of doing it. Monitoring, which is figuring out what we have done and whether it worked. And modification, which is changing our activity to better achieve our goals. So these are all steps we need to take in determining the tasks that we need to do. All of these tasks are critical. So compared with planning and implementation, most people find monitoring boring. But without monitoring, there can be no effective modification. So vast amounts of conservation effort, like translocating endangered species or restoring degraded ecosystems, have been wasted because they just weren't done correctly the first time, and no one took the time to monitor them and check if the outcome was what they expected it. And finally, the last thing to know what we should focus on is the highest priority of all, and that's whether we can address the cause of a population of a problem and not just the symptoms. So many of the activities that we described in this class only address the symptoms of large underlying problems. In particular, the peril of endangered species is really just a symptom of ecosystem degradation. And ultimately, that's a symptom of human overpopulation and excessive consumption. But of course, we can't devote all of our time and energy to the ultimate problem of human population and consumption and completely ignore the cascade of symptoms that it produces. But we can't really lose sight of what the main problem is, and that what we're looking at a lot of the time is just symptoms of this main problem. So if we can ever find ways to mitigate the problem or lessen it in any way, it's something that we should prioritize over just simply working on a symptom of the problem. So politics and action depend first on clarifying who even has the rights and responsibilities for the well-being of these creatures. So who owns the giant pandas? Who has the right to use them and the responsibility to ensure their continued survival? Is it the citizens of China? Is it only the people that share their range in the montane forests of South Central China? Is it all the world's people? Well, legally speaking, for the panda, it's the people of China. They own the giant pandas with the exception of a handful of foreign zoos that own specific individuals. For other species, though, the answer isn't necessarily so simple. So legal rights and responsibilities can rest with private property owners, It can be in local government, regional government, national government. It can be with international coalitions of governments, or with no one, or with everybody in the case of most marine species that live outside of territorial waters. So, in an ideal world, rights and responsibilities would be shared proportionate with the costs and benefits. For example, the people who live in the forests inhabited by giant pandas would have the greatest rights and responsibilities per person. But everyone, wherever they live, would have some rights and responsibilities. In other words, even though you might live halfway around the world from giant pandas and you'll never see one, you still have the right to ask for the continued existence of giant pandas and the responsibility to do what you can to help save them. So maybe by giving money to an organization that supports giant panda conservation. Although the rights and responsibilities of people who live far from the pandas range are quite small per person, collectively they might even supersede the rights of the responsibilities of the people that live close by. So for example, if people who inhabited the giant pandas range wanted to allow the panda to go extinct, their right to make this decision might be superseded by the collective rights of the whole population of the world who want the giant panda to survive. On a larger scale, the rights and responsibilities are left up to agencies, governments, NGOs, and corporations. So agencies, they will foster a global conservation effort. They regulate globally shared resources to help control international treaties. They facilitate the sharing of financial resources and the sharing of information. Governments are responsible for developing and enforcing environmental regulations. They conserve publicly owned resources. They encourage conservation through economic policy, and they support environmental education and research. Whereas non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, and corporations are able to use their flexibility to undertake actions that are not open to governments and to find innovative ways to advance conservation. But the rights and responsibilities of conservation are also up to us on a community and an individual level. Groups of people who live in the same area, who share same common resources, and who are confronted with common problems or who share common interests can be really effective in a force of conservation. So this is particularly true in rural areas of many developing countries where access to natural resources is often based on traditional uses rather than private property rights. So in other words, in these places, people's right to harvest wild plants and animals is based on the fact that their family has done it for generations, rather than a legal document that just gives them exclusive ownership. In situations like this, effective conservation requires empowerment of the communities. From the governmental side, this begins with recognizing the rights of the community. From the community side, it begins with recognizing the need for cooperation, both internally and between the community and the government. So once these hurdles are passed, the process requires sharing control between communities and governmental officials so that both community interests, like continued access to natural resources like firewood and livestock, and national global interests like maintaining biodiversity and maintaining atmospheric pollution, or minimizing atmospheric pollution, are met. So this sharing of the authority and responsibility of management by different stakeholders is sometimes called a co-management or participatory management, where they're really sharing it, the government and the local communities. But it's not just about communities, right? It's also about individuals. So conservation action begins with individuals, and there's a ton that you individually can do to assist with the efforts to maintain biodiversity. All organizations are simply assemblages of individuals, and all actions begin with one person, one catalyst. So the standard advice for individual conservationists is to think globally and act locally. So here are some things that you can do to follow that advice. So number one, you can be informed. So you can read, listen, think critically, learn your whole life long. And the conservation movement needs some emotion and subjectivity, but it also has an acute need for people with facts and objectivity. Two, you can become experienced. Information isn't enough, right? You need wisdom too. And wisdom comes with experience. So experience can come with age, but there are also shortcuts. You can travel, immerse yourself in another culture, another biota, for a few months or even years. If that's not possible, just seek out people in your community from different cultures who live by. Talk to them. Try to see the world as they do. And travel where you live. Go out and explore your local environment wherever you can. Our strongest motivations to change the world are often rooted in a strong sense of place and devotion to our homeland. Third, you can communicate, right? Call your elected representatives, write them a letter, write your local newspaper, corporations, anyone who's in a position to make a difference, and tell them what you think. Letters and phone calls make a huge difference. The environmental movement was founded in grassroots activism, and its strength still lies there. Also, don't limit your communication to distant officials. Talk to your family, friends, colleagues about conservation, because change really starts at home. Fourth, you can make your lifestyle consistent with your values. So, in other words, don't be a hypocrite, right? Practice what you preach. This can be difficult. It is easy to be self-righteous around people who own big gas guzzling sport utility vehicles, have more than 2 children, eat a lot of meat, and so on. But are you really more virtuous than those few of you of your fellow citizens who have no cars and 100% vegetarian, live in a small house heated only with wood that they grow themselves? So really just try to live as frugally as you can while still being happy. And start with just trying to reduce your carbon footprint and work from there. It's little things that you can build up over time to make yourself make your life more sustainable and to keep these habits and not lose them as quickly. Fifth, you can also support conservation groups. So many people are really generous with their personal money. And the United States citizens alone donated over $200 billion to charitable causes in 1 year. The majority of the funds, though, go to religion, which is about 35%. Health is 15%. Education, 13%. And conservation groups receive less than 5%, as do the arts and the humanities. So if you think this distribution is unbalanced, then you should consider directing most or all of your charitable donations to conservation groups. If you don't have a lot of money, give your time. Most conservation groups need extensive use of volunteers and interns. In exchange, you're going to get valuable experience from this. 6, you can become a professional conservationist. Around the world, millions of natural resource managers and scientists and educators and the like have dedicated their lives to conservation. So the financial rewards might be modest, not going to make a ton of money necessarily, but the personal satisfaction offers substantial compensation. So try not to think of yourself as just a student who happens to be majoring in biology or natural resource management or whatever. Think of yourself as a professional conservationist who happens to be a student right now. Or if you have a different career path in mind, that's fine too. You can contribute to conservation through things like citizen science. And citizen science, what that is it's a method of collecting real scientific data using observations from the general public. So there's a ton of citizen science programs that you can get involved with. So you can find one that interests you. So for example, let's say you like reptiles and amphibians. Well, Pennsylvania has a program called PARS, which allows people to document where and when they see a reptile or amphibian, and the data gets used by actual scientists to track populations and the distribution of species. Then there's eBird, which is international, and it lets you keep track of every bird species and individual you've ever seen. And while at the same time, it gives biologists important information about migration patterns, abundances, and distribution of species. Then there's iNaturalist, which works just like these other two programs, but it's more general. It lets you document almost any living thing. There's a ton of different citizen science programs that you can use. All of these I believe you can get as apps on your phone even to bring around with you. So just do some research into citizen science and see if there's one that interests you and just occasionally contribute. And then last, keep your perspective. So it's really easy to get depressed when we're looking at the magnitude of the biodiversity crisis. And when you're evaluating your chance of making a measurable difference, it's kind of hard to stay optimistic. To avoid that, though, keep your perspective focused on an appropriate temporal and spatial scale. So make life better where you live in your lifetime. Also, take heart that there have been some miraculous success stories in conservation that originated through the actions of individuals just like you. So Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, John Muir, and many others all had really humble origins, but they all accomplished great things for wild creatures. So this is the end of our last lecture for the class. I hope you guys enjoyed the class and learned some things. Hopefully you'll take some of the things with you. Feel free to stop by my office hours this week or next week. And even though class will be over next week, I'm going to hold office hours so that anyone can come and ask me questions about grades or just say hi or anything. So that's it. Bye, everyone.